Welcome back. Welcome to this last step of this specific section. In this section, we were focusing on introducing components to you. We created a number of components, the first component, second component, and third component. We also created a couple of class components. The first component was a class component, second component was a class component. This one was a function component. We saw that the function component was simpler to create. We included all the components that we have created inside the app component by using JSX. In React terminology, app is the parent component, first component is child component. Same is the case with second and third components. So app is typically called the parent component, the first component will be called the child component. One of the best practices that is typically followed in React is that each component is defined in its own file. In JavaScript terminology, each component is defined in its own module. One of the most important thing that a lot of Java developers who come into JavaScript struggle with is the fact that in JavaScript, any JavaScript file is called a module. So this app.js is now a module, and these are all the classes which are present inside that particular module. If I create a new file called firstComponent.js and put this specific class in it, then that would become a module and it would contain the class firstComponent. Let's start doing that in this specific step. So now I would want to take this component and move it to its own folder. So typically the folder structure which we would use would be in source. I would right click and create a new folder. So all the components would go into this specific folder. So in source, we created a folder called components, and inside components, I would want to create a new folder and call this as learning examples. We will later create a folder for counter, because counter is one of the examples that we would create. We'll also create a folder for to do. So we'll store all the counter components in one folder. We'll store all the to-do components in another folder. Now, what we want to do is we would want to create this component in a file. So what I would need to do is now right click. I would need to create a new file. I'll name this file as first component dot JSX. Typically, any component which contains JSX can be defined with an extension first component.jsx. So let's use first component.jsx as the name, and I'm going to, oops, I've copied the wrong thing. Let's go to the app.jsx, do a cut and paste in here. Let's save both the files. Will the code succeed? Let's see what error comes in. It says first component is not defined. App.js is saying first component is not defined. I have no idea where this first component is. What do we need to do? We need to import it in. So if you are using a class from a different module, what do you need to do? You need to first import that specific thing in. So I would now need to say import first component from, where is that file? Dot slash components slash learning examples slash first component. Oops, it says attempted import error. I'm trying to import this in, but it does not contain a default import. So it's saying first component does not contain a default export. Once you define a module, if you want something from this module to be available to other modules, you need to export it. The way you can export it is by saying export default. So this is the thing which you need to export by default, and do this. Let's see what would happen. When you look at this, it says now there are two errors. It says component is not defined, React must be in scope and using JSX, right? So we would need to import those stuff in. I'll go to the app.js and copy this stuff in. So what we are doing is we are importing React and the component from React. So now you would see that the application loads fine. One of the questions that you might be having is, why is it like this? Why is it, I'm saying React and component in braces. Why I'm not Why does it not work when you do this? It gives you an error. Why? Let's look at it right now. I'll open up the app.js. For a moment, let's say I would want to take the second component and put it in here. So I'm taking second component and putting it in the first component. Even here, this can be exported. So I can export any number of classes from a single module. So this module is exporting 2 classes. So now app.js wants to use the second component also. What would happen if I put second component as import here? Will it work? Nope. However, if I put it in braces and wait for a while and go, oops, it works. What's happening in here? You can see that the first component is the default export. So the default export alone, you can directly use it. For all other exports which you have from that specific class, you need to put them within curly braces. React is the default export from the React package. Component is exported, but it's not really the default. So if you want to use component, you need to put it within curly braces. In this step, we were playing around with modules. What we did is we took the first component and we created a new folder structure for the first component. What we did is we created source components, learning examples, first component, and we exported this and we imported the created module in the app.js. We saw that to import, we needed to add an import statement, import the component name from the path to the module. We saw that there were a couple of imports missing in the component itself. So we added the imports in, and after that we had to export default the first component so that we could get the first component working. And after that, we did a simple example of moving the second export to understand why curly braces are needed. Curly braces are not needed for default exports, but for all other stuff which is exported from a module, you would need curly braces. Now, I'll recommend you to do an exercise where you would actually move the second component and also the third component to their own modules. So what you need to do is create third component.jsx and the second component.jsx and move the second and the third components to those files. Do that as an exercise and I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye bye.